Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your co-host. This week we have a special President's Day edition of Next Round featuring Chris Cox. Now, you may remember Chris Cox as a former longtime congressman from Orange County. He was also chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission during the Bush administration. But did you know that Chris Cox was also a presidential historian and an author? And so we present to you this week a recording of a special luncheon that PRI held in Newport Beach recently, featuring Congressman Cox talking about his book and his interest in writing about Woodrow Wilson. So in his talk, you'll hear him share many interesting stories about Woodrow Wilson, and you'll also hear him in conversation with Charles Kesler, who, as you know, is a professor at Claremont, and he's also the editor of the Claremont Review of Books. So after the break, you'll hear Chris Cox kicking off his talk on Woodrow Wilson and his book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. I hope you enjoy it. Just released from Encounter Books, read the new book from PRI's Sally Pipes, The World's Medicine Chest, available now at your favorite online bookstore. The World's Medicine Chest explores how America became the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation through market capitalism. But as Sally Pipes writes, America is the last best hope for millions around the world who are battling rare diseases and chronic conditions. As you'll read in the World's Medicine Chest, we can do more to fight and cure disease, but only if we continue to embrace private sector innovation over government regulation. Buy the World's Medicine Chest today at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller.
President Reagan liked to start little informal talks like this with a joke, so I thought I'd start with a joke from Woodrow Wilson. The trouble is that Woodrow Wilson rarely told jokes in public. He did warm up crowds with his attempts at humor when he was running for governor of New Jersey, but then he routinely used what he called his darky stories. These were stories that had made him notorious at Princeton, especially because he used his faux black dialect. So I will not tell those. Fortunately, the Washington Post ran a feature story a few years back cataloging what their researchers had determined was the funniest story told by every United States president from George Washington forward. So here is the funniest thing that Woodrow Wilson said while he was president, according to the Washington Post. Quote, "A conservative is someone who makes no changes and consults his grandmother when in doubt." That's the joke. Let it never be said that the 28th president did not have a sense of humor. Sally has, as she said, allotted me 20 minutes, and I've just used 3 of them. So in the brief time remaining, I will not attempt to synopsize what is 499 pages of text and about 100 plus pages of notes and so on. Instead, I'm going to quickly tell you just a few things about Woodrow Wilson that you might not have known. Number 1, he was a Southern Democrat who defended the Confederacy and slavery throughout his academic career. We think of him, at least I did, as a Northerner because, after all, he spent his academic career at a New Jersey college, university, became president there, became governor of New Jersey. He was a Southerner through and through, born in Virginia, raised in Georgia till he was a teenager, then moved to South Carolina, then with his family moved to North Carolina. When he started college, it was in South Carolina at Davidson. He didn't really become a domiciliary in the North until he was 28 years old, when he got his first teaching job at Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. He was the last American president to have grown up with enslaved servants in his household. The war, the Civil War, and Reconstruction made an enormous impact on him. He hated Reconstruction. He wrote about this as a professor at Princeton. We don't have to guess what he felt at the time because he told us decades later as an adult. He lectured at Johns Hopkins in the year that he joined the Princeton faculty that slavery, quote, had done more for the Negro in 250 years than African freedom had done since the building of the pyramids. At age 46, while he was president of Princeton University, he wrote that slavery itself was not so dark America thing as it was painted. He claimed that the masters' human property were happy and well cared for. And he objected that outlawing slavery, as the United States did, invaded the privileges of self-government. In his History of the American People, which was published and republished during his tenure as president of Princeton University, he condemned the 15th Amendment, which banned slavery, which that was the 13th, the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. Allowing black men to vote, he wrote, prepared the way for the ruin of the South. Near the end of his presidency of Princeton, he spoke at the University of North Carolina in support of the Confederate cause. He said that the war had been a matter of conscience, and that made it imperative that the South should express its convictions, quote, in terms of blood. He went so far as to say that even if he had seen the end from the beginning, even if he knew what everyone knew then, that the war would kill over 500,000 Americans and destroy the Confederate government, he still would have opted for, quote, spending his people's blood and his own. It was all worth it, he concluded, because the South had retained her best asset, her self-respect. So here's a second thing about Woodrow Wilson that you might not have known. His academic works on the Constitution's separation of powers, beginning with cabinet government in the United States and then the book-length constitutional government in the United States, were inspired by his disgust with Reconstruction. As a professor at Princeton, writing in his History of the American People, Wilson described the Freedmen's Bureau, which had been set up to assist the newly emancipated, formerly enslaved population of men, women, and children. He described it as a disaster. By offering direct assistance to these newly emancipated people, Wilson said, the government was fostering idleness and vagrancy. The tasks of ordinary labor stood untouched, he wrote, while the idlers grew insolent and dangerous. He wrote that giving black men the vote made things even worse. A government sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes, he wrote, placed an intolerable burden on the white men of the South who were its natural leaders. The specter of a domineering Republican Congress that forced black voters onto these leading white men of the South is what inspired his rejection of the Constitution's separation of powers. Wilson realized that if Congress hadn't had the power to override Andrew Johnson's vetoes, then Reconstruction might never have happened. Congress, he decided, was too powerful. The end of Reconstruction, which came about as a result of the settlement of the disputed Hayes-Tilden election, took place when he was a senior at the College of New Jersey. And in that senior year, he first hatched his idea of grafting elements of Britain's parliamentary system onto the U.S. constitutional architecture, with the goal of weakening the legislative branch and strengthening the executive. As he expanded on this idea over the course of his academic career, it became ever more radical. Congress, as designed by the Constitution, he said, was a despotic and dangerous institution. Wilson proposed, therefore, that the leaders of Congress report to the executive, just as in Britain, members of Parliament serve the Prime Minister as cabinet officer. The President's cabinet members would sit in the Congress and take the place of the chairs of congressional committees, and they would control the introduction of legislation. This was a redesign of the American constitutional architecture that would have put Andrew Johnson in firm control of the Congress and prevented what Wilson viewed as the disaster of Reconstruction. A third thing, Wilson's opposition to women voting was originally based on his low opinion of women's capacity, but in the end, it was fear of federal enforcement of voting rights in the South that kept him from endorsing the Anthony Amendment until the bitter end. One of the great ironies of Wilson's life is that his teaching career began at a women's college, Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. He hated it. He bridled under the yoke of having to teach women. He complained at Bryn Mawr that teaching women history and politics was, quote, about as appropriate as lecturing to stonemasons on the evolution of fashion. As New Jersey governor, he declared himself strongly against women voting because of the social changes it would bring about. Near the end of his first term in the White House, he shared his views on women voting with a visiting friend who recorded his words in quotation marks in her diary. If women get the vote, it is the home that will be disastrously affected. Housework must be done, and who's going to do it if the women won't? In the following year, when he was campaigning for re-election as president, Wilson met privately with four what he presumed to be friendly Democratic women to explain to them the politics of women's suffrage and why he continued to oppose the Anthony Amendment. But one of those women was the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was herself a very active suffragist and member of Alice Paul's National Woman's Party. Harriet Stanton Blatch asked Woodrow Wilson in this meeting point blank, "Will you support the anti-amendment, he said no, he would not. And then he explained why. It was not for the reason that he had given for the past 5 years, because of his belief in states' rights. That was a mere dodge. Quote, dismiss from your minds the idea that my party or I are concerned about states' rights. It is the Negro question, Mrs. Blatch, that keeps my party from doing as you wish. 2 years later, Wilson did an about-face on the Anthony Amendment. He did it out of necessity. It was literally the night before 2/3 of the House of Representatives voted to approve it. 2/3 of the House does not vote on something unpopular, but that was where he found himself. And even then, it was the most limited of endorsements. He would not do it in his own words. He authorized visiting Democratic members of Congress to make the announcement for him. He would put out no statement and would not speak a word about it for almost the rest of the year. And even once he did speak his first words in support of the anti-amendment in an address to the Senate at the end of 1918, he subsequently backtracked and supported a Southern Democratic proposal to rewrite the words of the Anthony Amendment, to take away the federal enforcement that was in Section 2. The purpose of the rewrite, in its sponsor's words, was to ensure that only white women could vote in the South. Wilson's allies in the House and in the Senate tried to jam it through in the last moments of the Democratic Congress, or I should say the last moments of Democratic control of the 65th Congress, and thankfully for posterity's purposes, they failed, so that implicit protections for Jim Crow did not then become part of the Constitution. The newly elected Republican Congress, by the way, in the opening moments of their new session, immediately passed the unadulterated Anthony Amendment, and just in time so that women could vote in the 1920 presidential election. Woodrow Wilson took the unprecedented step of using the Secret Service to spy on his political enemies, including members of his own administration, whom he considered disloyal. 2 years before entering the war, World War I, Wilson issued an executive order expanding the mission of the Secret Service beyond its statutory charter. That statutory charter had been focused chiefly on counterfeiting, which is why the Secret Service was placed in the Treasury Department. The executive order sent the agency in a brand new direction, counterintelligence, that is, spying on enemies, foreign and domestic. Wilson convinced the Democratic Congress to fund the Secret Service and its new mission to the tune of $100 million, which today equates to $2.3 billion. And that fund would be expendable solely in the discretion of the president without any accountability or reporting to Congress or anyone else. Using this enormous slush fund, Wilson found plenty of domestic enemies to spy on. The suffragists protesting his opposition to the Anthony Amendment were placed under surveillance. So too were people like his high-level advisor Dudley Field Malone, who proved his disloyalty by supporting the suffragists. So were black leaders, including William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells Barnett, who had met face-to-face with Woodrow Wilson in the White House to protest his segregation of the federal government. And so was Wilson's significant other, to whom he was not married, Mary Hulbert Peck, when she came under suspicion for attempting to sell the love letters that he had written to her. I'll just leave it at that and say that I've got one little one I can stuff in here at the end. At the end of his presidency, Wilson's supporters, including Bernard Baruch, secretly paid Wilson's former mistress $500,000 in today's currency to obtain his love letters to her and destroy them. It is a footnote to the Wilson story, and in fact, it appears only in the endnotes to my book. But it's a telling example of how Wilson's carefully cultivated image of moral rectitude is really just a facade. So now Charles and I will have at it.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Well, thank you, Chris. To those of you who are getting a copy of this book at the lunch, have in front of you an enjoyable task of reading this critical biography, I think you might say, of Woodrow Wilson. And I was saying to Chris at the table that he had to read a lot of bad things in order to write this book. And he started the book in 2010, so 15 years ago. So I guess the first question is, why? Why were you moved to write this book?
Well, to be honest, I was trying to think of how I could get all of these people in one room, and it was a 15-year plan, and it seems to have worked. My interest in this really dates all the way back to when I was a law student. The first thing that I wrote for the Harvard Law Review was an article about a Supreme Court decision, the first one, to apply the 14th Amendment and its Equal Protection Clause to sex discrimination. It was a unanimous decision. That same summer, I happened to I was a law student, had a conversation with my grandmother out here in Santa Monica, and I asked her, what was the first presidential election you voted in? And she looked at me sort of crosswise, and she said, well, 1920 is the first time we could vote. And of course, I realized I had a lot more to learn here because I had overlooked some obvious facts. When I was in Congress, for 10 of my 17 years, I was in the elected leadership, and that entailed walking back and forth between the House floor and the Speaker's conference room on a daily basis, usually multiple times. And each time I'd go through the rotunda of the Capitol, I would walk by this big marble sculpture at one of the entrances, and it was a sculpture of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott. And it reminded me, no kidding, thousands of times that I walked by this thing of this same interest that I had for a long time. So when I ultimately retired from government, I started reading things about Congress, just avocationally. It was interesting to me because I knew something about it. And this emerged. The story that I thought I was writing at first was really the suffrage story, but Wilson loomed so large in the final act that when I worked with Simon & Schuster on the final book, they said, let's just make this into a full biography of Wilson.
So this is a biography which is critical, as I say. There have been several academic biographies of Wilson that have been critical in the last 10 or 20 years, but it may be the first main biography of him that is relentlessly aware of his limitation as a politician and as a human being. Wilson, one of the virtues of this book, which I commend to everyone, is that it shows the fashionable racism and sexism of Woodrow Wilson in his age. Of course, he was not unique. These were larger phenomena, of course, but they were concentrated in an interesting and important way in the figure of Woodrow Wilson. Still our only president who had a PhD, thank goodness. It could have been much worse for America, but we've so far escaped with only one PhD. Now, let me ask you a kind of superficial question. The title of this book is Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. What does that mean? Could you explain that title, please?
So The Light Withdrawn is an excerpt from a poem, from a stanza of a poem called Ichabod, written by John Greenleaf Whittier, an abolitionist poet of the 19th century, after whom, by the way, Whittier, California is named. Some people here must know this. The poem is an elegy to hero. Pardon, somebody. Oh, okay. Whittier, like abolitionists of the time, had idolized Senator from Massachusetts, great abolitionist Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster, towards the end of his career, when he had presidential ambitions, decided he needed to curry favor with Southerners, and so supported the Compromise of 1850, the centerpiece of which was the fugitive slave law. And this was, of course, anathema to abolitionists everywhere. The poem deals with the question of how we should respond when a political hero shatters our hopes and disillusions us. And it counsels against rage and says that we should just in silence, walk away, and we should think of the person as having succumbed to the snares of the world and so on. something that perhaps could happen to anyone, to any sinner. I thought that this would be sort of good counsel when trying to appraise Woodrow Wilson from the distance of a century and more. Presentism is a huge problem for any biographer to overcome. We don't want to judge people in former times by our own standards, our own experiences, and so on. And we have to put that to one side. And so that's the approach that I took. The hope is that this book judges Woodrow Wilson according to his peers, the people that were alive at the time. He was criticized roundly from progressives, from socialists, from people to his left. He was criticized roundly by Republicans, some of them progressive, some not. But conservative Republicans as well were on the right side of these issues of race and sex for their time, compared to Woodrow Wilson, surely. So while in some senses he was a man of his time, he was a Southern Democrat of his time. That surely is the case. But he was not a man of his time in the Washington, D.C. of the early 20th century. He pushed things way back. He was a retrogressive.
No, that's right. And the book tells that story very persuasively and very convincingly, and I think with a sufficiency of proof that is hard to deny. So the book takes its aim really along two tracks: the women's suffrage question and then civil rights for blacks after the Civil War and in the run-up to Jim Crow, the emergence of Jim Crow in the South, the sort of, the way in which the cause of black civil rights was set back ultimately for 100 years by the politics of the end of the 19th century, let's say. And the story of that story is told in this book, as is the long, interesting, and complicated, with many twists and turns, the story of the run-up to the 19th Amendment granting suffrage to women, finally. But this was a cause that had begun in 1848 and took almost 100 years in its own right to work its way out. So what do you want your readers to think of Woodrow Wilson once they've finished your book? What is it that you would like them to realize about Wilson that they didn't realize and that would color their future impression of him?
It's a difficult question for me to answer even after wrestling with these things for 14 years, because Woodrow Wilson rose to fame on other grounds. He was a war leader in World War I. He gave us, many aspects of our modern government. He gave us the Clayton Antitrust Act. He gave us the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve, the first income tax law, and so on. And people in this room may have objections to any or all of the above, but those are landmarks nonetheless, and something that might distinguish him in his presidency. On the other hand, the things that I write about here, first of all, I wrote about them because you have to say systematically biographers have put these things down the memory hole. They really went out of their way to avoid things that were available to them that they could have written about, and they chose not to. They chose not to emphasize them. By the time we get to the 1990s, particularly because there had been so much academic work done in this area, popular biographers decided they had to treat these subjects seriously, but none treated these as central to the Wilson presidency. So now come to the question that you ask, and how do I, having written all of this, assess him? And I still have difficulty equating, the moral failing of what he did with women, what he did with black people, the influence that he exerted on American society that has lasted far beyond his life. Equating that with structural changes like, giving us the first income tax law or giving us a new federal department. Are those things even commensurable? I don't know. If I were to try and weigh them, the question often comes up, Wilson was ranked very highly in the presidential rankings that historians do. So where would you put him? Like, would he be down to 25 or that sort of thing? And that kind of metric eludes me. I don't know how I would put a weight on one versus the other. So I just leave it to say what we've learned about Woodrow Wilson is that he is much more complex than was previously understood. He was not the hero that he was made out to be. He was certainly flawed in many respects, dishonest in some respects, like many human beings that we study and learn about. It's not all shock and a surprise. The lesson that I would refer is not so much about Woodrow Wilson himself, but ourselves and how we should appraise people in politics. We would be better off to take off our jersey and look at people issue by issue and decide what is important to us, what's most salient. Because when we look back 100 years ago, or 120, 30 years ago, people were still called Republicans, and they were called Democrats, and they were called progressives, and they were called conservatives. But the positions they took on issues, as Wilson himself demonstrates, might horrify us, even if we think that we should be on their team. It's not altogether different today. You can pick up a newspaper and see on a daily basis that newspaper writers cannot help but tell you, before they get around to tell you what the person actually said, that they are far right, or they are, Green New Deal, or they're this or that, and they poison the well, and we all fall for it. We would be far better off, I think, to be much more exacting in our assessments of people and in our votes for people, because we would be able to choose on the basis of more balanced, more informed appraisal of where they themselves stand. They're not always who their labels say they are.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
So Wilson, you show that Wilson was, in many ways, as you say, a kind of reactionary figure. He was, in our contemporary lingo, he was a racist, he was a sexist, and yet he was also an idealist. And one of the mysteries of Woodrow Wilson is that despite his the narrowness of his political vision in a certain way, he created, in foreign policy at least, a category of his own, Wilsonian idealist, going to war for human rights, going to war for democracy. And from that point of view, he's looked on typically, even today, as a kind of very advanced and progressive figure who saw a way forward beyond mere assertion of national interest to playing a kind of humanitarian role in the world, which he regarded as America's destiny. Your book begins almost with a quotation from Henry Kissinger, in which he says, America has never been the same, basically, since Wilsonian idealism. Our foreign policy has been changed and remains changed to some degree because of that. How could he be? How do you explain this man was a racist, a sexist, and an idealist?
Even Wilson's idealism is source for exploring his contradiction, because his idealism found fullest expression in his pursuit of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, he believed, in full scope of his idealism, would, if it were brought about, prevent future wars. And he was reasonably explicit in saying this in various speeches. He, I think, convinced himself that an institution, an international institution such as the League of Nations, could actually prevent future wars. That was idealism for sure, but it was quixotic also. And so it's not clear that it was a great contribution. When one looks at how the League of Nations itself was supposed to function, one of the first things you find is that Wilson's racism intrudes even here, because his own committee, the one that he chaired, the drafting committee for the League of Nations over in Paris, had voted to have essentially race neutrality be part of the League charter, that there would be non-discrimination among the races in the world. And Wilson fought against it first, and then when that was unsuccessful because he got outvoted, he changed the rules of his committee so that they had to be unanimous votes, and then voted against it, and that was it. And then so the League charter never had anything like that in there. So that is what I would call anti-idealism. Fast forward to Alice Paul. She managed to get that in the United Nations Charter, by the way. So not only race but sex discrimination is dealt with there. So that is as it should be if one is an idealist. The last thing I'd say about Wilson's really ineffectiveness at being an idealist even is that he personally was the reason that the United States did not enter the League of Nations. It did not ratify the Versailles Treaty. He instructed Gilbert Hitchcock, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, who was his ally, helping him try to get the League of Nations and the treaty through the Senate, which was controlled by Republicans. He instructed him to tell his fellow Democrats in the Senate to vote down the treaty that contained the League of Nations if it had any reservations whatsoever. These were reservations that the other allies had already accepted, did not require changes in the treaty. They were not amendments. They were just, that's why they're called reservations. And his being adamant on this subject caused Democrats, Hitchcock later said it was really difficult for him to convince Democrats who supported the treaty to vote against it. But they did. They followed Wilson's instructions. Enough Republicans had voted for it that if the Democrats who supported it had voted for it, it would have been approved with more than 2/3. But he destroyed his own baby. He killed what was his ideal. So I think Wilsonian idealism in its own time was a demonstrable failure, and we are left with Kissinger's assessment that we're now internationalists and we go abroad and we fight for human rights and that sort of thing, and that's all fine. But Wilson's actual example does not bode well for that kind of idealism.
Thank you. I have one final question. Woodrow Wilson, at the end of his administration, suffered a major stroke and was disabled. And his wife basically ran the government and communicated, relayed his communications to the cabinet. The cabinet didn't ever see him, didn't have a chance to talk to him. We've recently had a president who suffered from his own incapacity, Joe Biden. What is it that the example of the very sick Woodrow Wilson at the end of his term ought to have taught us, but maybe hasn't taught us, about the problems of a sick or incapacitated chief executive?
Well, I think, first of all, the main reason that we haven't learned the full lesson of Wilson's bad example is that the facts were not fully understood. It wasn't just that Wilson had a stroke when he was out on his speaking tour in the West, trying to convince the country to put pressure on the Senate and force them to vote for the League of Nations without amendment or reservation. He was out of communication with his cabinet, with the Congress, with the country for 6 months prior to that when he was in Europe. He was the first president ever to leave the country when Congress was in session, and he did it for half a year. He was over in Paris. He appointed himself, it's totally unprecedented, to be the head of the negotiating team instead of having his Secretary of State and diplomats and so on do this, as had always been the case, or appointing senators. And he was on the other side of the Atlantic at a time when transatlantic communication was almost nil. So we have an undersea cable that requires Morse code. That means you have a document. Somebody's got to put it in dots and dashes on one end and then decode it on the other end, and that made the documents very short, very time-consuming, very expensive. So Congress, under the Constitution, passes a law by presenting it to the president, but the president's not there. So bills can't get signed into law. The bills can't get sent over to the other side of the Atlantic because they're too long. And Wilson says, well, just wait till I get back. So he is completely out of touch with almost anyone. He gets these little cryptic cables, when things are really having an emergency, like the government's running out of money, which it was in 1919, and he was refusing to call the Congress back into session because they were now Republican. And so he was just over there thinking about one thing, his League of Nations baby. And we have race riots, we have inflation, we have all these things that had been nationalized during the war. The war is over, and we're trying to get back to normal. That was, Harding's campaign, return to normalcy. That's what he was talking about. None of this is getting attended to, and And so the country was without a president starting in December of 1918 all the way. And then we have the stroke when he comes back. I mean, he comes back and he tarries in Washington very briefly and then hits the trail to go speak about the League of Nations, the same thing he'd been doing over there in Paris, and still not paying attention to running the government. And so then he has the stroke, and then he's truly out of commission, and that takes us to, almost the end of Q1 of 21 after the election. So 1918 to 1921, no president. That doesn't even come close to comparing to Joe Biden, who is his own problem.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, and congratulations.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.